should we jump in? It's time.
Yeah,
Do
let's
we
go
want to wait
for
a
it.
moment?
Sure.
All right. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the good luck wishes also. We are Drupal Diversity and Inclusion. We are here to talk about why diversity, equity, and inclusion are everyone's problem. You may have seen it on the schedule as volunteer-led strategies for helping the Drupal community, or in previous iterations as, but I'm not privileged. Please do drop in the chat, say who you are, what brings you to the session. It's much more fun if we can follow along. And also, if you have a question, we have time at the end for questions. Please preface your question with a Q and a colon so that we can scan the list faster and get them going. So briefly, introductions of our team. I am Tara King. I work for Pantheon, and I am the leader of Drupal Diversity and Inclusion. I'm everywhere on the internet as Sparkling Robots. I use she and they pronouns. I'll leave it to Alana now.
I am Alana Burke. I work for Amazy.io. You can find me at aburke626, and I use she, her pronouns.
Cool. Hi, I'm Ellie. I'm hopefully unmuted and successfully using the platform. Yay. I'm doing some marketing and communications and documentation stuff at BDev these days. And she, her pronouns. I'm EKL1773 pretty much everywhere, which is just my name upside down and backwards on a calculator.
Oh my God. Mind.
My mind is blown.
And I'm Ruby Sinreich. My pronouns are she and her, and I work at a wonderful organization called Moms Rising. And you can find me everywhere on the internet as Ruby G with a J-I, except on Twitter, I'm just Ruby. And yeah, and I'm in Durham, North. I'll come to that in a minute. Never mind.
You're fine. We also wanted to do a brief land acknowledgement. Obviously, we are meeting with people from all over the world. I just saw someone checking in from Australia today. It's very exciting. We wanted to also acknowledge the Anishinaabe and Dakota people of Minnesota, where DrupalCon Minneapolis was supposed to be held, but since it's not being held, each of us have our own land acknowledgements to make. I am coming today from Tewa Lands in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
And I am coming to you from the Koch Tank lands outside of Washington, D.C. in Alexandria, Virginia.
Was it me next? And I'm here in Durham, North Carolina, which is has been the home for many tribes, including the Eno and Occaneechi people.
And I'm outside Pennsylvania on Lenni Lenape lands.
Awesome. Thank you all. Today, we're going to be covering a lot of material. These are the basic topics we're going to talk about. Why should we care about anything other than the code? Common fallacies in diversity and inclusion work. Going to touch on current events, a little bit about numbers, and some things you can do to make a difference. And then the end will be what we are doing in our community. And then we'll hopefully have time for questions. And just before I get started, I want to also acknowledge that we are going to be talking a lot about racism, anti-Black racism. And as you can see from our faces, we are all white people, largely femme people. We are working in a community that's also largely white. We think it's really critical to talk to other white people about racism, but we also acknowledge that we have a lot of blind spots, a lot of learning to do, and that, the voices of people of color should be recognized in this space as well. So just wanted to kind of start that off. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Ruby to talk about why we should care about anything other than the code.
I hope y'all will bear with us, as only one person can be driving the screen. So we're just going to try to keep the flow going. So a lot of people would like to just write code and not worry about social issues. And that does sound really kind of nice. But software is made by people and it's made of people. Kind of like, if you're as old as me or older, kind of like Soylent Green. Yeah, that's my joke for the olds. Okay, next slide. So as much as we would like to think that there is some kind of neutral reality, the truth is that everyone has values, things you think are good or bad. Maybe you love certain kinds of music, you love your family, as problematic to you as they may also be, and you appreciate your family's culture and history. Maybe you hate clowns, but you love well-documented code. You hate Flash, you value fairness. Whatever that may be, nobody's truly neutral. We often see ourselves as a default, though, especially when we're surrounded by family, friends, or coworkers that are like us and reflect those values back to us. Next. So all those values that we have, we bake them into everything that we make. It would be great if there was one source of social truth, like, the source of truth. But then we wouldn't have life's rich tapestry of different beautiful cultures and unique individuals. All of us like to think that everything we believe is objectively true. We're the right ones, right? But the real truth is that we each have our own perspective, and that's a good thing. And since it's easier to connect with people like us, we often surround ourselves with people who share our values. Even though that's not inherently bad, as Ken Rickard said in his excellent talk at DrupalCon Europe in last year, monocultures often can't see their own biases. So it creates an incredible blind spot. We get this idea that our truth is everyone's truth, but in fact, that's not really the case. So often, going to the next slide, we build rules and algorithms for the entire purpose of avoiding personal bias, right? It's like the whole reason, one of the reasons we try to create software, for example, is so that like it's not based on my friend or your friend, but it's just a tool and it treats everyone the same. So we like to think. However, we're building our values into all of those tools too. So we have an example here from Facebook's moderation rules. I have a great example of an algorithm I'm not going to share, but this one is a policy example. And even though they have made some definite improvements to how they moderate content, as I think we all know, both Facebook and Twitter have some very serious problems about the way they evaluate content and users. The rules are often written by people who haven't faced targeted harassment based on their identity, and it shows. We've also seen that these systems will bend their own rules to allow disinformation and hate speech to remain on their platforms because of political influences and other biases. And for example, in this Facebook example, where again, they're literally trying to build a tool that they think is going to treat everybody fairly. And in doing that, they created this distinction between protected categories and some subsets and decided that white men are a protected category, but Black children are not a protected category because that's a subset, right? This is like a very arbitrary rule. And it's clearly coming from a very distinct perspective. And I'm sure nobody intended bias when they created that rule. They thought this was going to be fantastically fair and consistent for everybody. But in fact, it actually just bakes the bias right into the system. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but if you've heard about the Amazon algorithm that there was a lot of news stories about last year that again was created to reduce bias in hiring. And they fed the algorithm all the data on who Amazon had hired in the past 10 years. And so what the algorithm figured out was that anyone with the word women on their resume was ranked lower. And if you had played high school lacrosse or were named Jared, then you were ranked higher. I know these are kind of US centric examples in some cases, but you can see how again, people are trying to create tools that are neutral, but they're actually missing the fact that they're building their own values right into those tools. So next slide. So we all have all these personal biases and values. And again, it's not necessarily bad that we have values, but we do need to recognize that we do. We should all work on investigating our own assumptions about ourselves and other people. But I'm not here to tell you how to fix your personal biases, even though it's something that we should all be working on for our whole lives. The problem I want to talk about is when those personal biases get encoded into our culture over centuries, and then institutions are built on top of that, taking those biases as fundamental truths. This leads to generations of injustice, and then bias moves from a personal issue to a systemic problem. This enables inequality to thrive even without anybody having to be prejudiced, right? All we have to do is believe in the system, that the system is neutral, and that keeps the racism going. So in this slide, this is a great timeline. This timeline was created by some artists who wanted to show that, in fact, 339 years of legal slavery in the United States was not really that long ago. A lot of people who are looking at racial injustice today want to say, well, slavery was so long ago, everything's even now, right? But actually, it wasn't that long ago. And I want to note here, they also didn't label the third period on their timeline, right? They have American slavery, segregation, and then what comes next. They intentionally left that blank because our history right now is still being written. And as hopefully everyone has seen, and I hope people joined the wonderful 8 minutes of silence that we just had on the stage, thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement and others that have been advocating, we really have a long way to go before Black people in the United States have the same access to power, wealth, and privilege that white people have as a whole, not individually, okay? So white institutions and our cultures have been used over time to reinforce privilege for white people. And after hundreds of years of having no rights, accumulating no wealth, and literally being the property of others, Black families still don't have equal opportunities. Looking at the quotation on the left from a sociological report, it talks about how a systemic inequality will produce inequality even in the absence of biased individuals. This is one of the most important points that I think we can make here. What this means is that it's not enough to just not be personally racist, which is also kind of impossible to do. Anti-racism is a process itself. But it's not enough to just ourselves be good people. We have to work to actively disrupt these systems. We have to be anti-racist. We have to be feminist. We have to be, for trans rights. We have to see who's being left out and work to actively include them. And I just want to give a super random shout out to Rob McBride, Drupaler, who is listed on this page from the Slavery Was So Long Ago page. He's listed there repping their awesome swag. So check out Slavery Was So Long Ago, and you can get this on a t-shirt. It's really cool. Props to Rob. I don't know what he's doing there, honestly. Just thought it was cool. So next. So all these systems privilege people, whether we want that privilege or not. Most privilege isn't something you can choose to opt in or out of. I didn't choose to have white privilege. My child didn't choose to have male privilege, but we got it anyway, right? And we also get a lot of privilege from our families and our communities, depending on how we come up. Moving on. So let's understand privilege a little bit better. We have to talk about privilege, even though it makes some people feel kind of squicky. It's not very comfortable sometimes to talk about because people start to feel very guilty. But privilege isn't about blame or guilt. It's about recognizing that these systems advantage and disadvantage entire groups through no fault or credit of our own. So it doesn't mean that you've done something wrong if you have privilege. We all have some privileges. And we all also probably don't have some other privileges. For example, myself, I am Jewish. I was very poor when we were growing up. I'm a woman. I'm a single parent. I'm queer. All these things can add up to create challenges for me in different ways. But I'm also white. I'm cisgendered. I'm American. I was born an American citizen. I'm a fluent English speaker. I'm college educated. My family did have enough money for me to have a computer as a kid, even though we were poor. And all of these things have worked to my advantage in different ways. Another example of privilege is that I didn't have to get up in the middle of the night to come to DrupalCon, but some people did, right? I'm very lucky. I'm fortunate in that way. So as John Scalzi, the very well-noted science fiction author, said, being a white male is the lowest difficulty setting. It doesn't mean that you automatically win the game, right? As you say, you can still lose playing on the lowest difficulty setting, but it's still the easiest one to win on. Or another way to look at that is that, say, if you are a white male, it doesn't mean you haven't faced challenges and done great work to overcome them. It just means you didn't face those challenges because of your gender or because of your race. Another way to look at that is the next slide. we all have some privileges. Peggy McIntosh was writing in the late 80s, good for her, about white privilege. And she's one of the first people to talk about this and explore this idea. What she figured out was that if racism exists, and I think we can all acknowledge that it does, it disadvantages some people, and that means that it necessarily advantages other people. She, in this essay, which is called White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, which is in this picture, we see a backpack full of cool things we're carrying around, but we don't even realize all these advantages that we have most of the time. In this essay, she has this great list of 26 different questions to ask yourself to get at your privilege. And I just want to read you a couple of them to help thinking about it. She says, I can arrange to protect my children most of the time from people who might not like them. I can speak in public to a powerful group without putting my race on trial. I can be pretty sure that if I ask to talk to the person in charge, I will be facing a person of my race. If a traffic cop pulls me over, I can be sure I haven't been singled out because of my race. Those are just some examples. Things as white people that we really think about very much as we walk through the world, but we're soaking in it all the time. And the truth is, there's no amount of anti-racist that I can be that stops me from having white privilege. But when I recognize it, I can decide what to do with my privilege. And we'll talk more about what to do with it a little later in the presentation. So the result of all of this is that none of us have to be racist to perpetuate white supremacy or other forms of systemic inequality. As Tara said, we're focusing especially on racial justice today, anti-Black racism in particular, but these issues apply in many, many ways. So none of us have to be racist to continue white supremacy. It does that just by us not doing anything to challenge it. And all of these values that are in our culture are getting baked into the software that we create. So if we care about Drupal being better, more equitable, more accessible, and helping to create a better world, which is something I often hear people talking about with Drupal, it's not enough to just try to be better people. We have to put the effort in to change the community and change our companies and change other institutions to really make that happen. It's not something we'll ever be finished with. There's no number. Once we cross some certain finish line, we'll be done. It's a process that we need to always be working on. That's it for my part.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruby. We're now going to talk about a few kind of fallacies that are common around these types of concepts, well-intended attitudes that don't actually help. You know, sending thoughts and prayers is not the same as actually helping. So we're going to just go through a few of these. And, oh, sorry, duplicate slide. Ruby, I'll pass it back to you for
It's me again.
tolerance. And
we're going to go around. Y'all are going to get to not hear my voice in a minute. But one of the first fallacies we want to address is the idea that if we just were all more tolerant and kind, all of these problems would go away. And that's a great idea, and we should be tolerant and kind. It's a good thing. However, civility doesn't fix these problems. The two reasons why are structural inequality that I just went on about at length, and the other is the paradox of tolerance. Karl Popper wrote in 1945, note the year is pretty relevant, that if we're not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. And you know, this idea comes up for us a lot when we think about DrupalCon and wanting everyone to be welcome at DrupalCon. But if there's someone who's here who's making other people unwelcome, then you have to make a choice, right? So tolerance does not trump everything else, and it doesn't fix all these. And we have a little Venn diagram, which I know is rudimentary, but I feel like it's important to say that. Can you go to the next one? Yeah.
oh, sorry.
People like to use Nazis as an obvious example of what not to include, but we have to draw the line a few steps before that, right? The point is that there does have to be a line. Being tolerant of intolerance negates the purpose of tolerance. So there has to be a line to protect people and to preserve justice in the community.
Thank you. Another common fallacy, especially in open source and in communities like the Drupal community, is that open source is meritocracy, which means everyone gets a chance to contribute, which again, on the surface makes a lot of sense. It's very intuitively accurate. But in general, in practice, what we find is that it is actually not true. It's not truly a meritocracy. Dries talked about this actually in his Seattle keynote, but free time to contribute is a privilege. Many of us who are underrepresented have a hard time finding enough employment, maybe are taking care of family members, maybe are struggling with other issues, and having a lot of hours to give to the Drupal project just isn't in the cards. So this kind of inequality can really contribute to a lack of diversity in open source. And it's not because those people who are not able to contribute more are not meritorious, are not worth it, but simply that there's not the sort of option to do that. So this is one thing that we find a lot specifically in tech and in open source.
Yet another myth is get women into tech first. And, you know, we'll just get everybody else in, then we'll move on to all of the other challenges. But if we don't address all of the additional barriers that are faced by women and people of color, then you're just improving things for white women. And maybe a few others will sort of hang on and get in there too, but it's not actually going to fix anything. So this is why we can't just talk about women in tech and we'll talk about race alone and so on. You know, issues intersect and they amplify each other. Audre Lorde said, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. And Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in 1989. So we think of this as like a new term that's just come up and be quite an old term. She also said, when feminism does not explicitly oppose racism, and when anti-racism does not incorporate opposition to patriarchy, race, and gender politics, often end up being antagonistic to each other and both interests lose. And I think we see this all over the place. But if your anti-racist efforts aren't also promoting feminism, and if your feminist efforts aren't also promoting anti-racism, you're not benefiting everyone, and you're not going to actually fix the underlying structural problems. And tech is definitely a place where we see so much, this is coming as someone who started their love of getting people into tech and this kind of diversity work by doing women in tech stuff. And it doesn't make, the idea of getting women into tech bad. Just make sure you're getting all of the women into tech and not just white women. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And this is something that we, as a group.
And on the subject of trying to get stuff done, nice policies and good intent are not enough. So I'm just going to hop to the next slide here. Privilege can often blind us to the impact that we may be having. So going back to the thoughts and prayers, that's another time when perhaps your intent is excellent and you're really thinking of that person, but the impact is negligible. So instead of thoughts and prayers, maybe a casserole or, a GoFundMe or something, And one way to think about this is your intent is, well, let's say you're carrying an anvil around my office and drop it on my foot. You sure didn't intend to drop it on my foot, I hope. If you did, we need to have another conversation. Anyway, your intent was not to hurt me, but you did. So that's the impact, literally. Impact. I'm going to let somebody else go.
And this one comes up also very often. We have one really smart Black person. Let's put her. Or, hey, we have one woman on our team. She wants to do all of our diversity efforts, right? No, she doesn't. I guarantee you. So this happens a lot. Just assuming that the people on your team who have dealt with these issues want to be the people who fix them. And, you know, we mentioned earlier in the talk that we're a bunch of white people and we're talking about racism, but it's important for us to do the work. While we do, of course, want to work with people of color and listen to their voices and promote their voices, it's also important for white people to do the work. We can't ask all of the Black people to do the work to fix racism. That's not how it works. And also, diversity and inclusion and equity are all very different things. This comic just explains it better, I think, actually could. Just making sure that you know the difference between them and you know what you're talking about when you use the different terms. It's sort of a little bit different than the quote on here, which goes back to what I was saying before. The pipelining diverse talent into workplaces that isn't prepared to support them is a vector for re-traumatizing groups. So this goes back a little bit to the women in tech thing. If you're not fixing the underlying issues, you're not actually going to fix anything. So if you have a racist company that isn't hiring people because they're racist, and you decide to just have some initiative to hire Black people, well, Black people aren't going to have a good time in your racist company. So you have to fix the underlying problems, the underlying problem being that you're a racist company, not that you're a company. That's your secondary problem. So you have to do the work to fix that so that you can, continue to fix the rest of the problems. Okay, we'll move on. So 2020, it is the actual worst. But we need to talk about this moment in history, right? And next slide. There's a lot going on. We are living through a pandemic and a revolution, at least in the United States. And it doesn't feel like anything is getting any better. Every day I wake up and I am terrified to look at the news or at Twitter. I just don't want to because I dread what I'm going to read. But lives matter. And we want to acknowledge that this movement has been going on for a very long time. And it is going to keep going on. And that the work is difficult and important and that change has to be made. On top of that, we want to acknowledge how difficult COVID-19 has been and how disproportionately it has affected marginalized people in the United States. Okay, next slide. These times are unprecedented and traumatic. Nothing is normal, and it may not be normal for a very long time. So it's very important to keep fighting. Make sure you're taking care of yourself. Step back when you need to, but be aware of the privilege of being able to step back and tune out. Maybe online therapy is a great help to a lot of people. Find a friend you can talk to, exercise, cuddle your pets, play video games. But remember that these may be new to you, but they are not new to many, many people, and they will keep going. But make sure you have your own oxygen mask on before helping others. We also want to talk about how did your company address Black Lives Matter? Think about these questions. Did your company issue a statement? If they didn't, why not? If they did you feel like it was genuine? Did they do anything else? Did they give a donation, some in-kind help, anything at all? Do you feel like your company is complicit in any way, or are they helping to fight racism? Has anything changed at your company? The way they do business, the way people are paid, who's in charge? Or do you feel like they gave out a statement and it was all just marketing? Many, many tech companies feel like because all we do is code, they should be neutral. But there's absolutely no room for neutrality when lives are at stake. So think about your company, whatever your position in your company is, and think about these questions. Place you want to be, or if you have room to make change. Okay. Another concern, it's okay. Another concern when we come talk about racism and the workplace is professionalism. Professionalism is a cultural concept, and it's subject to change based on so many factors. People of color, especially Black people, are so disproportionately affected by white ideas, to the point where we now have to have laws protecting the rights of Black people to wear their natural hair to work. They have to have laws that say it's okay for them to go to work wearing their hair the way it grows out of their head. You want to talk about privilege? That is not something that I have ever had to deal with. It is not something that white people have to deal with. Many Black people also worry about being unprofessional if they bring up at work. Do you feel safe bringing up social justice issues at work? What kind of response do you get? If you don't feel safe, why not? Are you worried it would affect your career or how others view you? Sit with these questions too and think about them.
So we also want to talk a little bit about numbers in the Drupal community. It's going to be real quick though. In tech, we measure what matters. We measure what we want to change, right? In Drupal, we have numbers around gender. They're kind of all lumped together as non-male developers. So it's both women and non-binary people. And I think maybe people who indicate other. As you can see, we're lagging pretty far behind kind of the global population of what you might assume would be women and non-binary folks. And we don't even have numbers for people of color in Drupal, at least not that I have access to. And we don't have numbers for people with disabilities. So, if we go with open source numbers, if we're at 4% like open source is generally, that's lagging the general population pretty far. A lot of people want these numbers. We just don't have them. And I think it's kind of indicative of the fact that we're not actually necessarily working as hard as we could be to welcome these people into our community if we don't even know who's already here. So with that, I'll just leave that with the numbers. Wish I could say that we had glorious pie charts, but we do not.
Alrighty, so we're going to do a quick breeze through a few things that you might be able to do yourself. So I know you just took in a lot of information, might be reeling a little bit and like, so what do I do? This is a quote from Susan Sontag, who said, "The likelihood that your acts of resistance cannot stop the injustice does not exempt you from acting in what you sincerely and reflectively hold to be the best interests of your community." So to me, this speaks to the moral obligations of participating in a space such as Drupal. If you are here and you care and you have opinions, please speak up, or speak up verbally or in text or however works best for you to help build a good place for everyone in the community. Next slide, please. So one thing you can do in any room, including this one, as we did at the beginning, is to notice who is in the room and who isn't. As we said, we are 4 femme-presenting white people. We'd really like to change that. Next slide. You can also hold space for and amplify the voices of others. And this is something that I know I have been doing a lot lately, is just keeping my own voice a little quieter and trying to listen to what other folks are saying, particularly Black folks on Twitter, doing a lot of liking, a lot of retweeting, amplification in that way. So if you hear a good idea from a marginalized person and you see that it's kind of been ignored in a meeting, maybe repeat it and give them the credit as well. That's really important. I'm going to just go to the next slide because I know we're a little short on time here. Also, you can be prepared to interrupt harassment and other problematic behavior. So this is like bystander intervention. If you hear somebody misgendering a coworker or a friend, just speak up and be like, oh, actually it's she, her, or it's they, them. And not a big deal. Just bring it up. Keep going. Next slide. You can talk to friends and colleagues about issues that matter to you. This does go back to the subject of being unprofessional or too political. So hopefully we can all work to smooth out those tensions over time. But do use your privilege and be an advocate within your own community. Next slide. We can also all work to fix recruitment and hiring in our companies. Stop saying that there aren't any women or people of color available to hire in open source and tech generally. We are here, hello, and we are looking for work. I'm not actually, just disclaimer there, very happy. You can't expect to hire different workers if you don't have different applicants. So you have to improve your own pool that you're looking at. And one resource I found recently was diversifytech.co, had some really nice job boards and whatnot. Next slide. And then finally, woohoo, something you can do is participate in Drupal diversity and inclusion. That's us. We have regular weekly meetings on Thursdays in Drupal Slack. You are very welcome to join. They are text-based, asynchronous. And yeah, moving on. Tara?
Sorry, I had an internet lag. I think I'm back.
You had pixels.
Oh, hi. So I'm back. And then, of course, the last thing to do is participate in Drupal diversity and inclusion. Who basically, as far as I understand it, so
Paul.
I think we lost New Mexico.
I think we lost everyone. Tim just popped into the chat too. And we lost Ruby's audio.
You forgot to unmute.
Yeah, so we had some more at the end here about some of the barriers that we're talking about generally. Yeah. But we could also probably just go to questions at this point.
That's true too. Tara says, can we hear her? No, we can't.
Nor can we see you.
Ruby, are you pulling it up?
Yes. Here we go. I apologize. I'm not sure which slide we were on, though.
That's it.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. Who's talking about this? So as we said, this is today we focused a lot on issues of anti-Black racism, but intersectionality is absolutely essential, and it literally doesn't work to focus on one of these without addressing the others. So, and even making lists like this is problematic and impossible, but we wanted to throw it in here to make sure that people understand that we are definitely not just looking at one or two dimensions of things at a time. Tara, do you want to talk and I'll just drive the slides?
I can talk some more, hopefully. I just switched to a different internet provider, so hopefully a little more stable. Actually, I think this is Ellie's side. Do you want me to take it?
Please go ahead.
Okay, so Didi and I, sorry I missed things. I hope I'm not repeating stuff, but we hold weekly meetings. A lot of our focus is around community building, providing a safe space to connect with other underrepresented people in Slack, in our Slack, and also to provide feedback to community leaders, support them on different projects, do a little rabble rousing here and there, and education as well. The ways that you can get involved with us are on this slide. So we've got, oh, it's not quite up yet. Sorry. There we go. No, you're fine. Our booth is on like the very bottom of the booth page, but we're there a lot. If you join and click the interest button, you'll be entered to win, if you're in the Passport program, $200 worth of books full of anti-racism resources. We're super excited about sending that to somebody. We also have our weekly meetings on Thursdays These are in Slack. It's a great way to just get connected with people who are also working on these issues, help contribute back to the Drupal project in this particular area. We have an issue queue on Drupal.org and a resource library that is like that link that Angie sent would be an awesome addition to the resource library that we have. And of course, we're on Twitter, so you can follow us there. Alana is running a super awesome speaker training for underrepresented Drupalists. Is it right after this, Alana, or in 2 hours?
No, it's 1 hour.
1 hour. Okay.
Hour and 15 minutes.
Cool. This was a big project of 2019 for us, was to fundraise to get this curriculum built out for the Drupal community. And it's to address imposter syndrome, help people find pitch ideas, to sort of improve speaker diversity in our community. So 3 days, if you take 1 hour session with Alana, and then afterwards it's like a work session if you want to join for that. With that, we have 5 minutes for questions.
I did see one from Amy back in the chat here.
Oh, awesome.
She said, I noticed the new question mark name is DE&I. Is that diversity, equity, and inclusion? So the answer to that is that is a new initiative from the Drupal Association, and we continue to be Drupal Diversity and Inclusion, DE&I. Maybe somebody else would like to elaborate on that a little more.
But also in general, yeah, people have switched from just saying diversity and inclusion to diversity, equity.
The term of art is evolving. But we were formed 4 years ago as a result of some sessions at DrupalCon in New Orleans in 2016. And so we were just called Drupal Diversity and Inclusion.
Yeah. Checking for questions. Please feel free to drop them in. Joe writes, you mentioned holding space for others, which is something I've been trying to be conscious of. You have suggestions regarding things I can do to not, do you have suggestions regarding things I can do to not only hold space, but also make sure that space gets filled by someone who isn't just another white male?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question.
One of the things that we do as an organization is try to do things like, hold scholarships and help groups and say like, hey, we're going to help, pick an underrepresented person to do, whatever it is, like whether it was a scholarship to DrupalCon or, code of conduct training or speaker training. So if you're doing something like, I don't know, maybe you're giving up a speaker spot, like have an idea of who you want to speak there. So maybe you're going to, offer that spot to, someone from a specific, sort of throw it back out there to the wider pond, like have an idea of a group that you want to turn around and say, hey, I want someone from XYZ community to, do this. I see this a lot on Twitter, like people are saying, hey, I want, a speaker from the Black community or the LGBT community or some kind of community to come in and speak here. And I think it's better to sort of, have that kind of idea in your head instead of just abdicating.
I think also this question is a great example of how that neutrality can still be biased.
Thank you, Michael, for being an awesome sponsor to our Open Collective. We use that money to do things like have scholarships, and we'll use that for our prize money. We also generally use it for our booth, which we didn't need the money for this stickers and printouts and booth materials and things, but that'll allow us to do more in the coming year in terms of virtual things that we can. We really appreciate our sponsors in the Open Collective.
I would like to speak a little more to Joe's question. I think it's a really good one because it demonstrates sort of how even if you do recognize your overrepresentation in a situation and you step back, if you just leave a vacuum, it's likely to just be filled by the same patterns, right? And so people with privilege are, again, more likely to take up that space. So that stepping back is a good first step, but it does require that intentional effort to think about who goes in there. And in addition to reaching out to maybe, as Alana said, finding people, reaching out to people or people who know to fill a slot, a leadership opportunity, a speaking opportunity. Another thing to keep in mind is that our own communities look a lot like us and also like think a lot like us. And so it can be really important to try to reach outside your community, which is, of course, is extremely hard to do, but it's what we have to do. So it's, step one, good to think about, your, a woman friend, a woman colleague who can fill in there. But even better, what about like asking her if she knows other people, or asking an organization outside of your own network to do that. And that's something a lot of camp organizers come into the diversity and inclusion channel and ask us every year, how can I diversify my camp? And one of the problems is people are only talking to their own networks. So you really just have to get outside of that. Do you have some more questions?
We have a question. Tips or pointers for how to help people join the conversation at work? There's good intention, but people seem to be anxious about saying the wrong thing.
Oh, that's such a good one. Can I take this one and then I'll toss it anyone else? It's true, and especially right now, things are precarious, right? And a lot of people are afraid to talk about things for fear of saying the wrong thing. Someone asked yesterday when I was talking about whether there would be a buff for people of color, and someone said, well, won't that be considered racist? There's a lot of confusion about this kind of stuff. It's really important to understand that we are going to all get it wrong. We all make mistakes. None of us is like, the champion of the woke Olympics and going to tell everybody else what to do. We're all working on it and we all screw up. So that's very scary to bring things up, especially if you are in a position of having to counter a dominant culture and being like, hey, y'all, the same way that we do things every time, maybe we need to do it differently, because people are going to go, well, what's wrong with the way I'm doing it? But if you have enough privilege to do it, that's a way that you can use your privilege to speak up. If someone's got your back, or you have enough power in that situation, speak up anyway. Just be ready to be wrong sometimes too.
I see we have someone.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I see we have someone in our moderation queue. Eileen, I just want to make sure before I hit the button, your audio and video will show. I'll let Alana talk, and then when you're done, I'll let Eileen up on the stage.
I was gonna say, for people feeling comfortable, it also really helps if talk about diversity and such comes from the top. I'm gonna call out Michael here because he happens to be my boss, but I knew going into working at Amaze.io that I would feel super comfortable there because he is involved in diversity and inclusion about it. And when I first signed onto our Slack, he had his pronouns in his profile, and I was like, this is a person that I already know that I can bring up these issues with. This is a person that I know that I can trust not to, fire me for bringing up an issue of diversity and inclusion at work or making it an awkward discussion. And just knowing that already made me feel more comfortable at work, and knowing that I could talk about that kind of thing. So I think it's really important for the people who are in power to be active in those kinds of discussions and make it clear that they're comfortable with those kinds of discussions, and also to be comfortable talking about them.
Okay, after Eileen, Andrew has a good question too. Let's get to that one after her.
Cool. I hit the plus button.
I think it's coming. It seems to take a minute. Well, possibly not.
Eileen, I'm sorry if I kicked you out. I didn't mean to. Feel free to jump back in. Andrew's question, in the meantime, has anyone had success convincing their orgs to do something that isn't free or a one-time donation, like not paying entry-level positions so little that only relatively privileged people can accept them?
This really comes back to the question that Alana was saying when, talking about organizations making statements, but like, are you actually changing the way that you're doing anything? Are you changing the balance of power in your organization? I don't have specific advice, although there's one example I love that I have used a lot about at Etsy. A friend was the engineering or the CTO or something in charge of things there. And they wanted to increase the number of the diversity of the engineers there. So instead of just trying to toss people in and let them sink or swim, they actually created an entire engineering school that people could go through. And then at the end of the like Etsy training, which was a comprehensive engineering school, then you could see which people you wanted to work with, which ones wanted to work with you, and things like that. And they, I forget the number, but they made a huge change in the percentage of women engineers and other diversity of the engineering staff there by doing that. But that's a lot of work. I mean, it's the real question of whether organizations are committed to it or just paying lip service.
Oh, wait, here's Eileen.
Here comes Eileen. Perfect.
Wonderful. Yay, we didn't lose you.
I had extra buttons to click. I'm sorry, before it would let me in.
Oh, you're fine.
So
Yes.
I have a question. As a chair, we are a charity organization that was granted a Drupal 7 coding for a cause site build about 7 years ago, and we hadn't had a lot of upgrading done, so we went back to touch base again at the camp where we met our team that had volunteered to do that, and I was surprised at the difference of the Drupal community over 7 years. So we had been involved for the first year or so, following up. We can go into meetups and that kind of thing. So I don't know anything about Drupal other than the fact that we use it as a charity for a teeny tiny little site that had gotten hacked into at one point. So, and we had a little bit of repair work, but not too much over the years. Just to see the change in the community, that it was about half its size. There were mainly well-established Drupal developers, not very many students involved anymore, and they were no longer doing the volunteer, what I thought was considered volunteer, which was the volunteer site builds for local charities. That was kind of a big deal. We participated in a site build 1 year and then waited a full year to apply to have our site built in a sprint by this team of students and experienced developers. And so when they talked contribution, I was like, oh, I thought that, okay, that's what you're talking about. Contribution was now, they could, and back in the day, they were doing, you could contribute to Drupal itself. That was one classroom, or they would choose typically 2, sometimes 3 small local charities to have a sprint build attempted by the students. And they kind of quit doing that. And so I was sort of curious as to, clearly, it's hard to have folks asked to be doing stuff, work for free. But in addition, to have experienced developers have to sort of then support the sites that get built by the students that may or may not get finished. But what, and I felt kind of nervous after that, using the term volunteering or contributing in a way that talked about doing any type of volunteer development work or coding work or front end or back end or site work. Understanding that when we went back this time, we realized that, we got a grant once. That doesn't mean you get a grant forever, So we went back knowing what, as a 990N miniature charity organization, we put together what we could scrape together, hoping to, reattract some of our old team or kept a new team that would be interested. And we knew what we had put together, completely unaware of the cost of websites and builds these days, and completely unaware of the value and completely unaware of the, the price tag. And I think it was neat, that experience, because actually the volunteer that jumped in worked remotely with international students who wanted to participate and volunteer, and to realize the few $100s that we had put together is like a teacher's annual salary in another country, felt like it would make sense as a way to be inclusive and diversify, and to say that we can't afford thousands, we can't afford an agency to redo this, when they decided we had to jump from 7 to 8. But because I wouldn't even have known where to hire somebody. As a small charity, we were granted a grant. So I never even knew how to go about hiring a person in the US, in my local neighborhood, let alone somebody from around the world who our small amount of stipend and appreciation could change a life.
Eileen, we're over time, so I want to ask you to kind of wrap it up, let us know what your question is or what you want to talk about.
What is the terminology first of all, what is the terminology I should be using even for like that type of volunteer work? Is that something that the Drupal community is now against? Or And then how do I encourage that? How do I encourage that as a means of diversity and inclusion?
It can be problematic. I work for a nonprofit myself, and I've been using Drupal since 2005 when it was very grassrootsy and a lot of tiny organizations were using it. And frankly, Drupal has gotten extremely expensive to use. And I am going to say something that might be a little bit controversial, but you might want to consider a different platform besides Drupal as you rebuild your site. Because if you don't need the advantages that Drupal offers, you can get a much more affordable site that's easier to manage that will be sustainable in the long run. Depends on how you're using Drupal, of course. Drupal has advantages for community sites, for complex data, things like that. But there are other sites that are much easier to maintain and to on. And you should check out the nonprofit BOF. I actually started writing a comment here. I don't know if you went to, there was a nonprofit summit today. There's also a BOF on Thursday.
Oh, good.
And so the thing is, finding a volunteer to build you a website is often doesn't work out in the long run. Oh yes, thank you, Nick, so much for mentioning Backdrop. A great middle ground is Backdrop, which is a Drupal distribution that is designed for nonprofits and smaller budget organizations, and it is simpler to take care of and to maintain, and it's maintained in the longer run without a lot of the complexities that are introduced at Drupal 8 and higher. So check out Backdrop; it's really good. Thank you, Nick. All right, cool.
Right,
thank you for sharing that.
We are over time. I know there's other sessions people want to get to. Come to our booth if you want to chat. We have our BOFs we've been dropping in the links. Please fill out the session evaluation. Here's our, yeah, that's everything I think, right? Thank you all so much for coming and for your time and for your curiosity and good-heartedness. We appreciate you being here.
Thanks so much for coming and listening and thinking about all these things, folks. See you.